I would say in 2020, as the markets were going a little haywire. Frankly, when I got into it, I was on a family vacation with my wife's family. They do an annual trip to Nantucket every year. And so we were there, and I was listening to Modern Finance, which is Kevin Rose's podcast. I know he's been a guest of this show.
Yeah, of course.
And he had something on Flamingo DAO, which I had never heard of a DAO, period. Certainly didn't know what Flamingo DAO was. And after that hour or however long it was, I thought, oh my gosh, I feel like, they talk about like getting red pilled or whatever, or orange pilled. That was my moment where I thought to myself, okay, I think I've just learned something or stumbled onto something that can be unbelievably impactful for society and helpful and solving a lot of problems that I currently see with the internet and in our capital markets and with access to financial products and all these sorts of things. It was really my aha moment.
And you were on the Financial Services Committee at this point.
I was. I went through the paces on crypto to make sure I wasn't ignorant, but I hadn't really gone deep on crypto. Mm-hmm. And then I spent a good chunk of the next few months going as deep as humanly possible and just learning about the different L1s and what an L2 is and what's the difference between these tokens and how are these applications working. And
you were actually like participating in DeFi and like...
Yeah. So the way that I did it was, I'm on the committee and there's no rule against this, but I don't necessarily think I should be, investing in crypto assets while I'm thinking about regulating them.
Shocking.
There probably should be a rule against it, but there isn't.
Well, there's just no regulation at this point, right? Like back then.
Well, yeah, it's the whole host of things that don't make sense. That's probably one of them. I kept reading these white papers and coming to a conclusion, which is, man, I feel like I can only learn so much. Like I need to actually play with this stuff a little bit so I can figure out how these things work. If I'm going to be knowledgeable in the space, like I should at least have some sort of feel for it. I mean, it would almost be like asking somebody to, I don't know, like regulate cell phone companies, but you're not allowed to use a cell phone. So in my head, I thought, okay, well, I don't think I should be investing, but I do want to play around with it. So I took like a little margin, a couple $100 or something, and started playing around in DeFi. And I quickly realized I couldn't do anything with my ETH because the gas fees would destroy it. Did that for like a couple of weeks. And then my plan, which I ended up doing, was I'll just give it all to the United Way when it's over. The United Way accepts crypto donations. And so I did that for a couple of weeks. I forget how long it was, not too long, but ultimately learned probably more playing around with it than I ever could have just reading. And so from that, not only did I feel like I understood it better, but I also felt like I could legislate in a more thoughtful way. And so from there, we've kind of been going deep on it ever since. And it's been interesting. And we're getting to a point as a Congress, which is really nice, where I feel like we're getting close to finally legislating on it, specifically around stablecoins. We'll see if we get there, but I think that's sort of the first bite of the apple coming off the Terra Luna crash.
Do you feel like there's critical mass now of enough people in Congress and maybe specifically on the Financial Services Committee who like have done that work, who really understand it now? Or like, or is it still in the like people are legislating on cell phone service without using a cell phone?
So we're past that on financial services. So like take a step back for a second. If you were to just think Congress broadly, I would say 90% of members don't understand it at all. They've heard about it, but like they don't know it, right? Maybe their kids use it, grandkids, whatever, but they don't know much about it beyond that. The next 5% are people on my committee who are getting up to speed, who understand the basics and the building blocks. We've had a couple hearings now that have been really productive, I think, and had some great witnesses. And, they want to be thoughtful in the space, but maybe they feel a little hesitant because, it's complicated. If you've not really gone deep, it's hard to understand it. And then the final 5% are folks like me who have spent a ton of time on it and are now coming to some pretty clear views on what the right regulatory framework should be. And that may sound daunting, like you got 90% who don't know anything about it. But the truth is that's how most issues are around here. That's why I say that's where the real work happens. The committees lead because these are difficult, complex issues and you need real expertise. And then if it's the right set of members and it's the right policy, they can pull the other 90% with them. I think we're getting to that point where that 5% is comfortable on both sides of the aisle to really engage in a thoughtful way.
This is reasonably bipartisan in its support or lack of support. It's not sort of split left-right. It's kind of split on age or demographic lines.
Yeah, so that's what I've noticed. I'll say this, like going in, right? Like just walking into the debate for the first time, Republicans tended to be more supportive than Democrats. I'm not sure entirely why that is, but as a general rule, Republicans were more supportive than Democrats. Having said that, within those two bands, the bigger break was on demographics. So the more senior a member, the more skeptical they're likely to be. And this makes sense, right? If you look at how crypto is used. And the more junior the member, and mostly by age as opposed to tenure, the more likely they're going to engage in it and try to understand it. And that's largely played out. But as the weeks and months have gone on, even the more senior members have realized, hey, this is something we really need to tackle. I think the president's working group, they put out a paper, which some of it I agree with, some of it I don't. The most meaningful aspect is that the White House signaled, hey, this is important and we need to work on it. And I think that's really jump-started everybody because we've had a whole bunch of hearings as a result, and now there's real legislation being debated.
Yeah, so let's zoom in on legislation being debated. We're going to go schoolhouse rock here a little bit, but how does something go from a vague concept of we probably need legislation in this space to becoming law? And what is the committee's role in that versus a general member?
So you'd be shocked at how many members seem to completely forget about Schoolhouse Rocks when they come here. I think they can just like unilaterally say, oh, I know how to fix this. It's like, yeah. Do you have a co-sponsor? Is it bipartisan? No? Okay, sit down, please.
For our international listeners who may not have been exposed to this, it was on PBS, right? Or I feel like it was all over the TV when we were growing up.
Where was Schoolhouse Rocks?
I don't know. Everybody pause this, go to YouTube, search I'm Just a Bill, and then come back.
That's exactly right. To summarize the video y'all are about to just watch, the way something like a crypto bill would work, okay, is Congress sort of gets it in their head that, hey, we need to legislate in this space. A whole bunch of catalysts for crypto in particular, but that's sort of a conclusion we've all come to. And at that point, the committees will hold hearings, and usually they're on a number of different topics related to the main, if you will. So we had one specifically on stablecoins. We had one specifically on CBDC. We had one on crypto markets just sort of broadly. And you go through that process, and it's a pretty in-depth process. And every time if you're smart, you're preparing for these hearings, it's multiple hours. You and your staff are trading questions back and forth. And as you develop your understanding, you start to come to some conclusions around what you want to do. My view is the best legislation is durable. And in order for something to be durable, it needs to be bipartisan, and it should be bicameral. Bicameral meaning House and Senate. So my perspective is always, you got to give yourself a chance by starting with some Democratic counterparts. So if I'm legislating on a bill, what I'll do is I'll base this on committee comments. So I'm listening not just to my own questions, but I'm listening to how other people are processing the information. And I'll say, okay, so these two people over here, I think I can work with on this. So then you just literally go tap them and say, hey, you want to do something on this? I think sounds like we're in a similar place. And from there, your staffs get together and you all trade notes and legislation back and forth. And then ultimately, hopefully you've come to some good text. You propose it. It will get a vote in committee if the committee chair wants it to. Once it goes through committee, it goes to the House floor, passes the House floor. Now it gets kicked over to the Senate. They can take it or not. Most of the time, Senate ignores us, but sometimes they listen. And then in the Senate, they have to beat the filibuster. So they need to get 60 votes over there. We're just simple majority in the House. And so a little harder to get things through that. But then from there, it goes to the White House and the president signs it into law, and away we go. As simple as that sounds, it's the most frustrating, chaotic process you can imagine. Things that should take 6 months, take 6 years.
Well, you were explaining to us last time we chatted in preparing for this that no bill ever is pure of scope. It's the Christmas trees, right? And stuff gets hung on it and, all sorts of, so you may be wanting to regulate stablecoins and there's totally unrelated stuff that gets added onto that.
Yeah, totally. So that actually happened to crypto in particular on the infrastructure bill. So there was a big infrastructure bill that was passed not terribly long ago. The one I worked on a lot is bipartisan, bicameral. It started in this group called the Problem Solvers Caucus, which is a group I'm a part of. Great group. For most people who are frustrated by Congress, they'd be encouraged by this. It's 50 Republicans, 50 Democrats. Everything we do is bipartisan. It's a great group. It's all the members who you've never heard of, but are actually very productive and stay off cable news, but work hard. So Problem Solvers Caucus put the infrastructure bill forward, at least the principles. The Senate worked out the details. And then this is also frustrating. You get the bill 4 seconds before it's voted on. It's not like you get the bill a week ahead of time.
Oh, I've been a part of companies closing financing. Yeah, you get it 4 seconds before the deal's done.
Yeah, exactly. So politics isn't the only place with this issue. So the infrastructure bill gets through the Senate, and all of a sudden, people are high-fiving, and it's like, oh, wait a minute, there's a crypto provision in there in the infrastructure bill? Why is there a crypto provision in the infrastructure bill? Well, because we have to pay for the infrastructure, of course. And so somebody slipped in a little tax without really telling anybody. And ultimately, it came into the infrastructure bill and was signed into law. And that's sort of the Christmas tree version of how legislating works. And admittedly, the person who crafted that provision didn't intend it to be as wide sweeping as it was. There was a thought that basically we were going to label any developer working in crypto a broker, which would kill the industry, if everybody has to register as a broker.
And what is the tax?
Well, it would have been, if you are a broker, then you have to do XYZ, which would involve you registering, paying taxes, et cetera. That was part of it. And the goal is to get at something real, which is, if you don't have good tax compliance in crypto, that's another thing I probably realized when I was playing around with it a little bit, is like, if you're not careful, you can break tax law pretty easily in this space.
Oh yeah, like the default is you do.
Yeah, the default is, right? And so like one of the first things I did is like, I need a software, like this is all on chain. So surely there's a way for this to automate and track for me. And I won't name the product because I can't endorse a product, but I found a particular software that I liked, that I used, and helped me track all that stuff. But the motivation was a sincere one, which is, hey, we want to make sure that people aren't evading taxes. And actually that's what it was. It was going to require, it wasn't a tax on the broker. It was going to require anybody who was defined as a broker to provide tax information to the IRS. So it would have required developers to all of a sudden provide tax information.
Which makes sense if you're not familiar with crypto, because that is the way that our USD-based infrastructure works, where if you have a brokerage account somewhere, you can just count on the fact that it's calculating all your taxes for you. It'll tell the IRS and it'll send you a copy so that you know what to pay. And of course, or at least you know what to include in your tax return. And because that's not mandatory in crypto, none of the brokerages do it. So it's actually a little bit difficult in many ways, well, especially in DeFi, to figure out what your taxes are. But you face this other problem where it may not be what we think of as like a brokerage or an exchange that is generating these taxable events for you. And so you would need every application developer to be spitting these things out too, which is, as you mentioned, pretty untenable.
Right. And so the senator who proposed that had to like go down to the well of the Senate and basically say, I did not intend for it to sweep in all these developers, and wrote letters and those sorts of things. And that's actually important to do, because that way, if anything ever goes to court, they could refer to that as, hey, this was actually congressional intent. It wasn't to sweep up all the developers, but was to actually, go after legitimate brokers. And so, that was an aha moment, I think, for all of us, but certainly for the crypto community, was that infrastructure bill. And so, that's unfortunately how things do get legislated around here a lot. I am hopeful that with respect to crypto, though, that going forward we'll be more thoughtful and do things like what I think is appropriate, which is to take sort of little bite-sized chunks as we understand them. Because the last thing you want to do is put something forward that you only sort of understand, and then ultimately you cause a heck of a lot more problems than you intend to. And so that's the direction we seem to be going in crypto, and that's actually really encouraging and not normally how we operate around here.
What do you think is like the right or the directionally right framework for regulation that should exist for crypto, given here we are in summer 2022? And then the second question is like, what do you predict the coming months of regulation is going to look like, to the extent it's different?
Yeah. So what do I think it should be? I actually think we should look to the Clinton administration for how they handled the early internet. And they orchestrated around the phrase do no harm. So Bill Clinton, rightfully, I think, came to the conclusion that, hey, look, there's a lot of weird stuff happening with this new internet thing. And like these chat rooms are weird. I mean, like,
oh yeah.
Remember, those were nasty places.
We were all teenagers in them at the time, I think.
Barely teenagers, yeah. I think my first AOL chat room I was in, I was definitely not a teenager and shouldn't have been in there. But having said that, there's some pretty terrible things happening online. And you could have made an argument that the right thing to do is to shut it down and tamp it down and control it and regulate it to death, basically.
Oh, and this was the era I'm remembering, right? Where like a bunch of people in Congress wanted to like end video games.
Yeah.
This was not a crazy sentiment in the country at the time.
No, this was kind of how people felt. And Bill Clinton actually provided the right leadership there, where he said, that, first, do no harm. Let's let this thing breathe. Let's see where it goes. And then once we understand it better, then we can propose a set of regulations that make sense for the space, given what it's becoming. It won't always be nasty chat rooms. And he was right. And so, slowly but surely, we worked up on the regulatory apparatus. Do we get it perfect? No, of course not. Congress is infinitely fallible. We never get everything perfect. But I think that was ultimately the right playbook for that time and space. I would argue the same mantra should exist today, which is, yes, are there things that are bad that happen in crypto? Absolutely. We talked on one, tax evasion. Does that happen? Certainly it happens. Of course it happens. As you said, it's probably the default. You have to decide that you're going to pay taxes. And so that's something we need to work on. And there's other areas as well. But should the response be to destroy the entire industry before most people understand it and before it's even had a chance to really develop into anything? Certainly not. My view is the mantra should be do no harm and take bite-sized pieces as they become obvious, but don't overreach. And I suspect that's how Congress will behave. I do fear that the administration will take a more heavy-handed path, mainly because the SEC chair is pretty hostile at times in its public comments on crypto. That's, I think, where the give and take will be. But that's also why it's so important that Congress actually puts laws forward, even if they don't pass, but just by showing there's bipartisan support for a set of principles, that in and of itself will send a message to the regulators that, hey, we're actually pretty far away from where Congress is, and that's not a good place to be. Because the last thing you want to do as a regulator, you propose a set of regulations, and then Congress just flips them on you. My hope is that the energy we're seeing, which is becoming more and more bipartisan by the day, will ultimately lead us more down that do no harm path as opposed to the heavy-handed path.
So what do you think the bite-sized early regulation will be, sort of on the steps to getting a more complete regulatory framework?
My view is stablecoins are probably the most straightforward to figure out. And part of it, comes from the Terra Luna issue, right? And I think what that did was, one, it awakened members of Congress to what can happen when things go wrong, right? And this was a happy surprise. It also forced members to confront, okay, what is this algorithmic stablecoin thing, and how is it different from a fiat-backed stablecoin? And what, if anything, should we do about that distinction? And so I've been really encouraged by how well members have articulated that distinction and have grasped that distinction. And so what I think you'll probably see is some sort of law that enshrines a, quote, payment stablecoin. That language has been used in a couple different bills. A payment stablecoin as essentially a fiat-backed stablecoin. And then my preference would be that we're silent on algorithmic stablecoins, and we'll figure out what exactly that is later. Is it a security? Is it something else? Is it a commodity? I don't think there's actually a clear answer to that, because they're all different, right? And they all have different properties, and they don't all work the same. I would say let's focus on fiat-backed stablecoins, because I think we all actually agree on that. And intellectually, that's not that difficult. Fiat-backed stablecoins, you're really talking about what's the reserves, what are the reserve qualities, what are the auditing requirements, what sort of attestations do they need, and what sort of redemptions and consumer protection things do you want to build into that? If you can answer those questions, you can probably define something that looks like a fiat-backed stablecoin. Algos are much harder.
Who got the truth? Is it you? Is it you? Is it you? Sit me down, say it straight. Another story on the way. Who got the truth? Who got the truth now?